Okay, another quick question, or just like quick thoughts. Not to go into it too deep, but this question of, does it seem like in the Christian version of things, the Christian text, that there's this assumption that it forever is interpreted that there'll be these divides in certain roles between male and female in terms of a type of hierarchy, that the man has to be over the women and such. In general, I tend to think that eventually it seems to hint toward, so at the context of the time within the movement, it is a liberation movement, and it's like the seeds are being planted, and there seems to be hints that eventually there will be this increase of freedom and this actualization of all humanity available to have this free, liberated access to God and this personal relationship to God. And it also seems as though, because people say there seems to be this like biblical order of things, that it has to go from God to Jesus to man to woman, as though it's to be in that order forever. And as though the certain types of bringing social order to the initial stages of the church and whatnot are mandates for all time. And I tend to not think that, because for one, there's just so much that seems to be initiated at that time, where the context of the movement was in a type of occupation, or like there was an occupying force over them. And there were certain protocols and practices that seemed to be an attempt to keep the societal movement going. Certain offerings given, certain ways initially that they shared amongst one another, to keep the movement going. And so you would assume that built into the whole purpose is that eventually there would be freedom from those kingdom dominions, that the seed was planted to proclaim freedom, but moving through all of the kingdoms to generate that freedom would take a while. And so there does seem to be this assumption that eventually there would simply be this like hoped for universal freedom among the world nations unto God, freeing everyone to have that spiritual connection to God, and that spiritual development unto God. To be a language where he's trying to portray this to them, where within the context of the tendency for men to have a certain hierarchy over women, he seems to be interpreting it in ways where it's kind of there, but then he introduces it as like, so like this language of like the husband to give you, to serve your wife as as Christ serves the church and laid his life down for the church. And it's kind of this sense of like, there are certain responsibilities, but recognize it as similar to Christ, still within the world dominions, giving service and transformative value and support unto the church, or like the husband unto the wife. And so it really is a transformative approach. It's not saying that there's a domination over women, and it seems to be more of a connotation as a likeness of Christ unto the kingdom recognition of limitation or limiting freedom. And so you would then ponder that the work of Christ, though, isn't assumed to be underworld dominion forever. And so that seems to frame those approaches. And also it says to something to the effect of like, but for the most part, like serve each other as unto God. And so it really is still very transformative, because as you grow in God, and as the world dominions shift, and as liberation increases, and as money is shared among each other, creating a safety net and things along those lines, as these things develop, it seems to be these seeds that assume that eventually there's just going to be this incorporated freedom to where it's difficult to just have that differentiation, because people will simply be centered within their own spiritual freedoms, and there won't continuously forever or for eternity be these like protective measures in that same type of way. Eventually, if you imagine, if it gives us language that Jesus is in God, and then man is in Jesus, and then woman is in man, then eventually it's like all in all. And it talks about that. Eventually it talks about being all in all. But of course, there's times where when we live unto a spiritual recognition as the interdependent unit that we live in, there's going to be a need to have some kind of differentiation between things. But it doesn't mean that there's like a devaluing there, and it doesn't mean taking on another oppressive approach or things like that. Anyway, the main point that I'm making is that there's seeds planted that seem to suggest that eventually things will shift and become even more toward a further freedom, and the very things that throughout creation limited freedoms and created the need for these designations and these roles eventually will no longer be there. And so in that, people live in faith, in that growth, in that spiritual growth. There's times where they can live in that express freedom, and then also expect that eventually there will continue to simply just be more of that freedom. But then it also calls people to live in context of your situation. What increases situations, not just asserting authority and things like that, but like how do you discern between what will increase the various receptivity of various situations and whatnot. And so there's also that time of, as it says, like to serve each other, or to seek for that which like edifies and builds up and doesn't just like entrap or hinder people. And so it does seem that a lot of it is in the context of survival among the system, keeping the movement going, certain levels of social order in the context of the times, not as though God needs all of these things forever. And so it does seem as though that's how it's read or perceived